and welcome to the Jurisdictional Action Network webinar focusing on building the business case for company landscape action in cocoa. My name is Leonie Aurora. I'm the Landscapes and Partnerships Lead for the Tropical Forest Alliance, or TFA. And this webinar is organized jointly by the World Cocoa Foundation, TFA, Proforest, and CDP. Before I introduce our speakers, just a few housekeeping notes. During the webinar, please feel free to post questions via chat or in the Q&A box. We will try to respond to as many as possible during the webinar. If you have any technical problems, please also put in the chat, or you can also email Jack Lloyd. You can see the email address on the screen right now, and it will be available also in the chat. And just to note also that we are recording this webinar, and we will be posting the recording alongside other resources in the JA Resource Hub. So through this webinar, what we're hoping to do is to build understanding on the evolving business case for companies to engage at landscape and jurisdictional scale, and to look at sustainability in cocoa production landscapes holistically. This webinar will also share some findings and build on recommendations from a study on company landscape engagement in cocoa that TFA, Proforest, and CDP have collaborated on. This report was launched last month. We will start the webinar with a brief presentation on the study, particularly on what we found as the main reasons cocoa companies have taken landscape action. I will do the presentation then. If you can go to the next slide. Then we'll have a panel with excellent speakers. We have Ethan Budiansky from the World Cocoa Foundation, Cedric van Kutsem from Mondelez International, and Mike Senior from Proforest. And we will also have Norma Pedrosa Seo from CDP, who is also part of the research team, to present recommendations from the study briefly. So without further ado, let's go to the first part of this webinar. So we know that individual supply chain actions alone are not enough to stop deforestation. And while landscape approaches have been used for a long time in, for example, in conservation, in the past 6 to 7 years, many stakeholders, CSOs, and also companies have looked at how to use landscape and jurisdictional approaches as a way to address commodity-driven deforestation. So at this point, we thought it would be a good time to explore why and how companies have taken landscape action and collaborate with other stakeholders on efforts beyond their individual supply chains, as well as what would be or could be new levers to build the business case for companies to scale up landscape action. So as such, TFA, Proforest, and CDP are collaborating on a 15-month study to dive into these questions. And we have the full research team here, including Tarika Lucci from Proforest, Norma from CDP, and myself here in the webinar. So if you have any questions about the study, please feel free to put them in the chat under Q&A. And just to highlight that our focus in the study are downstream and midstream companies, and why we focus on them is because they are further away than production areas of these commodities. And as such, their business case in engaging in landscape scale will be quite different from those with direct production in these areas. We also look at the company action in each forest risk commodity. We're looking at 5 commodities: cocoa, pulp and paper and fiber-based packaging, or PPP, palm oil, beef, and soy. And we take this approach because what we find is that companies use landscape and jurisdictional approaches differently, depending on the production models of the commodity. The existing or current sustainability efforts that have been done, this includes certification schemes, companies' own sustainability programs, as well as the context of the regions or the countries where you have like major production areas. Cocoa, it was the first commodity that we looked at. And based on our desktop research and company submissions to the CDP Forest questionnaire on landscape and jurisdictional engagement by companies in 2022, as well as interviews with dozens of companies, landscape initiative implementers, and other experts, we've identified at least 29 downstream and midstream companies that have invested in at least 20 landscape initiatives. If you can go to the next slide. And if you look at the report that we have, we will also put the link to the report in the chat later. You will find the list, this list of landscape initiatives. And just to note that the study considers and reviews diverse landscape and jurisdictional initiatives, and we recognize that they are in different stages. But what we are looking at for landscape initiatives are the basic tenets that these initiatives seek and promote multi-stakeholder collaboration to achieve shared goals in the landscape or jurisdiction. Or in the absence of agreed shared goals, when there are no agreed shared goals by the stakeholders in the landscape, that the actions taken benefit not only individual company supply chains, but also the wider landscape. There are many findings of the study. The ones that we'd like to highlight here are what we heard from companies as the main reasons why they engage at landscape scale. Can you go to the next slide? So the first, what we heard from cocoa companies is that they engage at landscape scale action to comply with their own sustainability commitments. And these commitments include commitments towards the millions of smallholders producing cocoa, which in turn will support long-term sustainable sourcing from the production landscapes. In cocoa in particular, we find that a number of companies have built on their sustainability programs that have existed for a long time, built on these programs and integrate them into landscape initiatives where they collaborate with other companies, with governments, and also with local communities. And this positive collaboration with other stakeholders is another reason why cocoa companies take landscape action. Another reason is that working beyond supply chains not only would benefit their production areas, but this type of collaboration could also attract funding from other sources and for other purposes. They are strongly linked to land use, like protecting biodiversity or climate mitigation. Last, but definitely not least, companies are also taking landscape action, including conservation of forests that we celebrate today, as well as restoring degraded areas to reduce emissions from land use change, particularly as more companies commit to climate goals. The guidance on what action could count against companies' climate goals is still being developed. But as deforestation and climate change cannot be addressed only by supply chain actions, there is expectation, or at least hope, that landscape action would count in the future, at least partially, against companies' climate goals. So there is this thinking also in mind. With that, I would like to turn to our panel. We have a great panel here to build more on these findings on why companies engage at landscape scale for cocoa. We want to talk to Ethan Budiansky, Senior Director for Environment at the World Cocoa Foundation, the lead convener of companies for taking collective action at landscape scale. We have also Cedric van Kutsem, Senior Director of Cocoa Life at Mondelez International, which has invested in at least 7 landscape initiatives as part of its Cocoa Life program. And Mike Senior, Deputy Director for Conservation and Land Use at Proforest, which facilitates and implements the Asunafu Asutifi landscape initiative in Ghana, as well as other landscape initiatives around the world. So we hope to have time for Q&A at the end of the panel. So please do put in your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A box. And I see now in the chat already a lot of greetings from different areas around the world, from Ghana, the RC. Thank you very much for joining, or from Kalimantan as well, Indonesia, where I'm from, Indonesia. Great. So let's turn to the panel. I want to ask Ethan first, I guess. Can you tell us why WCF as a cocoa platform is building the case for landscape scale collaboration?
Great. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today. Yes, I'm Ethan Budiansky. I'm the Senior Director of Environment at the World Cocoa Foundation. I also take a lead role in the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. So it's been 5 years since the launch of CFI, the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, with 36 companies, IDH, the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. This is an unprecedented collaboration, transforming the sector, driving transparency and accountability, stronger collaboration, public-private partnerships. We're promoting collective action and data sharing and driving best practices on the ground and addressing some of those systemic issues towards deforestation. And we've made a lot of progress. The governments have adopted satellite monitoring, they're putting in place forest policies, working on national traceability. The companies themselves have made significant investments in the past 5 years. For example, last year they reported investing in about 23 million tree seedlings for the promotion of cocoa agroforestry and restoration. They're focused on improving traceability down to the farm level, mapping 800, almost 1 million farms, 800,000 farms, achieving 72% traceability, and annually working with about 800,000 farmers on good agricultural practices and climate smart cocoa. Now, governments and companies have committed to the continued and hopefully growing success of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative moving forward. But moving forward, we are now focused on the next phase of CFI 2.0, where we really want to focus on accelerating and scaling impact on the ground. And the way that we want to do that is to evolve from supply chain focused investments towards collective action and pre-competitive collaboration through landscape approaches, focusing on forest conservation, landscape restoration, and improved livelihoods within those landscapes. So moving forward, we're focusing on investments towards the most important landscapes, driving participatory processes within those landscapes and multi-stakeholder collaboration, building synergies, efficiencies, and coordination at the landscape level to drive greater impact. And the ultimate aim is to establish deforestation-free landscapes that are addressing those systemic issues towards deforestation. All of this in alignment with the up-and-coming EU regulations, and also aligning industry efforts to reduce Scope 3 emissions as part of their SBTi commitments. The intent is to ultimately facilitate greater private sector engagement within landscapes, greater investment, and then bringing on board new partners and new funding. And we're doing this by building on landscape pilot activities that we've started over the past year and a half. For example, and what Mike will be talking about very shortly, is the Asunafo partnership, the partnership in the Asunafo hotspot intervention area in Ghana, in partnership with Proforest, with the Forestry Commission, and an initial 8 companies. We're also building off of the work that we did with the World Resources Institute Global Forest Watch to create the West Africa Cocoa Farm Dataset, in which we brought together 19 companies to share almost 1 million farm polygons. And in aligned deforestation risk assessment methodology, we're utilizing that to then identify those opportunities and areas to build collective action and collaboration. So let me end there, and thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ethan. That's a lot of information, very good progress that have been made. I'm going to turn to Cedric now, as from Mondelez, as one of the members of the Cocoa Forest Initiative as well, right? One of the founding members. So can you describe for Mondelez right now, what is the business case for taking landscape action?
Sure, thanks. And hi, everyone. And thanks for having me with you today on this important panel. I think a landscape approach for us is important and very interesting, because with Cocoa Life, we do have the ambition to make the cocoa we need more sustainable. We started the program back in 2012. We're now in the 10th year, and we will continue until 2030 with a renewed announcement we made last year. And we believe having a landscape approach, and actually many landscapes, can help us to get us there. As we all know, I believe challenges we see and we face in cocoa are very complex and are all interconnected. So we can't focus on one topic only. We need to look at all these in a holistic way and therefore need a holistic approach to tackle these challenges, which is what we've been promoting and implementing with Cocoa Life over the 10 years. And our approach has been demonstrating quite some success so far. And the way we've been doing this, we have been investing over the years in really improving processes in the communities and empowering these communities to drive their own development. This then led to the systemic change we need to see happening on the ground. And we believe this approach can actually be transposed to a landscape or a jurisdictional approach. We think a landscape approach will allow us to actually look beyond one supply chain, and in this case, cocoa. Drivers for deforestation in these countries are cocoa, but also household fetching wood, but also illegal mining and many other reasons. And therefore, we can't look at one crop only or one supply chain only. And through a landscape approach, we believe we can then convene all the right stakeholders around the table. And we really think that's the most important. It is very important because one company alone, nor one sector alone, can really solve the issues we're facing. So we need a stronger collaboration in the interventions that are implemented. We cannot continue to work in silos. We need to come together. And importantly, this needs to be guided by national strategy, which under CFI, we now really see in the case of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and I'm sure in other countries also. So I think just to close and to summarize, I just want to insist that at Mondelez, we believe a landscape approach can really pave the way for stronger public-private partnerships that can help to support farmers in working towards deforestation-free production, but while also having the positive impact we need to create on their livelihoods.
Thanks, Cedric. And I think your point about having cross-sector and cross-commodity collaboration is one of the difference, right, on landscape and jurisdictional approaches. And I think we see as well in cocoa, like what our study found is like the initiatives that started in the past 2 years that focus on cocoa, they have also like other commodities. And it's like 13 out of the 20 landscape initiatives identified actually have more than one commodity. So that's a real potential that needs to be harnessed and realized. So, Mike, we heard mention of the Asunafu Astifi landscape as a great example of not just company collective action, but also like coordination with the government and with other stakeholders. Can you elaborate for us what are the opportunities and challenges that you see on the ground, right, for this landscape?
Thanks, Leonie, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. Unfortunately, I should say, it was supposed to be our Africa Regional Director, Abraham Baffo, talking about this, and he's much more familiar with the landscape than I am, but I'll try and do a second best job with it. So yeah, opportunities and challenges. I mean, the first thing is, I think we need to recognize the really positive progress that's been achieved in the Asunafu landscape so far. So as Ethan said, it's a collaboration with the Forestry Commission in Ghana, with 8 cocoa companies and WCF, working closely to develop shared goals. And I think this was the first thing that was needed really to get this landscape initiative, as for all landscape initiatives, off the ground, is to define those common goals and get the key stakeholders around the table. I would note as well, I think, given the differing drivers of deforestation in the landscape, the fact that we've got such stakeholder participation is really positive. And what that's meant is that the progress so far is that a baseline assessment is being completed and a management and investment plan is in development and has been through a series of iterations. And really now it's ready to move into implementation. And as Ethan said, I think I just want to call out a few particular opportunities that this landscape action and initiative can demonstrate in Asunafu, but in general as well, which is that firstly, acting beyond individual supply chains is crucial in the cocoa sector, in particular, where all production essentially is from smallholders. Deforestation happens outside of supply chains in most cases. It's by individuals clearing land, and only when they go to sell later are they actually going into a supply chain. So if we want to tackle those root causes that Cedric was talking about, we have to work pre-competitively and proactively to engage with those kind of actors, many of whom are just looking to secure a livelihood. So we've got to get ahead of the game, and we've got to work pre-competitively. I think the opportunities, particularly for the private sector, beyond actually tackling the root causes of issues that are going to affect their supply chains in the future, are potentially efficiency. I think, there's a lot of focus at the moment, understandably, for companies on compliance with the EU deforestation-free products regulation. SBTI is also a driver. I think there's a challenge to kind of square together the desire to meet those compliance targets, but also take a longer term view, which is why I think this topic and webinar is really crucial. But I think actually what we're finding from some of the latest discussions and engagement through the platform in ASNAFA, but also through the work of WCF and others and Proforest in Ghana, is that we can probably go further in this collaboration. So as as Cocoa Board and Forestry Commission develop their cocoa management system, the National Forest Monitoring System, there's really great opportunities to do some advanced piloting of that in the ASNAFA landscape as well, where we can see how companies and the government can work together. And maybe that brings me on to some of the challenges. I think, no one's going to deny that there are challenges to work pre-competitively. Data sharing, is always going to be a challenge, and I think that's why we have to get started. And the ASNAFO sort of trust that's been built there provides an opportunity to do that. I think the other challenge is really just how do we deliver that scale that Ethan is talking about. As we've said and have heard, companies have been working individually in some of their programs, some of which, like Cocoa Life, have achieved a lot, but how do we take it up to the next level, as Cedric was saying? I think landscapes offer a great opportunity to do that, and I think we've just got to get started. We've been able to leverage for the ASNAFA CDP landscape some additional donor funding, which is something that would only come with the sort of platform that's there. The next step is getting the private sector funding and other sources of funding coming in, so that we can start that rollout and start to deliver these benefits that we're trying to all work towards collectively. So I'll leave it there, and I hope we can get into some more discussion as we go forward.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think it's great that in ASNAFA you have already a plan and sort of like then rolling it out, right? And then start achieving those outcomes. And totally hear you about the time. And it's something that we hear also from other commodities, right? The fact that it takes time to build this multi-stakeholder collaboration is a challenge, but it also promises about sustained engagement later on. You and also Ethan earlier touch on the EU deforestation regulation, and kind of want to turn to that. These are some of the changing contexts that we're having in right now, right? The EU deforestation due diligence, the governments and as well as companies are pushed to build up action to address the climate and the nature crisis. And what are the possibilities of these levers to build on the business case? So just because you just talked about it, Mike, earlier, can you highlight, and especially as Proforest have developed guidance to meet EU deforestation regulation and offered landscape and jurisdictional approaches or engagement at that scale as a way to comply with this regulation? Can you explain a bit more, like how you see landscape action can help with that?
Thanks, Leonie. Yeah, so I think a lot of this is captured very well in the guidance, and essentially just to frame a little bit what Proforest developed with some operational guidance for the private sector in the cocoa sector to come into compliance with the EU deforestation-free regulation. This is guidance based on a best guess of what the final regulation will look like. We know that there's some of the details still being worked out. But what we tried to look at in particular was how can existing tools and approaches and initiatives on the ground support companies as they try to get into compliance with the regulation. And we think there are a lot of opportunities there. And we looked at 4 main things. So firstly, producer country sustainability programs and systems. Secondly, international and regional certification schemes. Thirdly, collaboration approaches writ large, including the work of CFI and landscape initiatives. And then finally, companies' own systems and programs. And essentially what we found is that you can't deliver the regulation with one of these alone. Actually, you need a smart mix of all of them. So I think that's the key point, that, you know, a lot of people talk about the smart mix. I think in the cocoa sector, that's particularly true. And how to operationalize that in practice, of course, it is very challenging, and companies are looking into this as we speak. But I think to focus on the role of landscapes, which is the topic for today, I think, as I said before, the key point here is that I think they are a practical scale at which we can really get that collaboration working. I think if we try to boil the ocean by getting the perfect systems together, up and running all in one go across the whole world and across whole countries, we know it's going to take time. So let's leverage landscapes as the scale where we can build that pre-competitive collaboration, as Ethan said, find ways of working together to build and support, for example, shared traceability and monitoring systems. You know, there's the work that WRI are doing, which is already something really valuable. I think the next step is, how do we sort of mesh that together with the national forest monitoring systems in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire? How can we work out ways of sharing without sharing data, so that companies are comfortable to come in and get what they need out of it that can help them comply with regulatory demands coming down the line as well? So I think, again, the big point there is potential for efficiency, but we've got to get started. We've got to get round the table again and again to work out how we can make this work on the ground, really.
Right, and maybe I'll turn to Cedric to provide a company perspective on the EUDR as well as other evolving context right now. What would support Mondelez to be able to invest more in landscape action?
Well, if I'm here, I hope it means we're already investing a lot, right? But we could certainly invest more.
Can always do more.
I would always agree with that. I think, well, there are a few elements, I think, critical enablers. One is we need to see across the landscape strong operation and governance, and with really two key components, one being clear decision-making process across the different stakeholders, private and public, but also where progress can be honestly reported. So that notion of trust is critical. Second, I think each landscape is very different, and we need to be very explicit about which are the quick wins versus the more complicated long-term changes that are required, and that might require much more resources and time. I think it's important to have that reality check and to manage expectations of different stakeholders. That should also allow us to then draw a clear line between what do we see as collective actions and what should be more individual actions. So we can, all pick from the menu and see who should really be held accountable for what and can be responsible for what. We're talking about enabling environments, and I think it's critical to have these, of course, with the right regulations also. And these regulations need to happen at different places. We need some regulations more at global level, and this would include the EU regulations, for example, you were referring to. But then we also need regulations at national level and then really at local level. For example, Asunafor, or there's also the San Pedro landscape we're working on in Cote d'Ivoire. And then the very last one I would have in mind, but maybe I should have started with this, because I think it's really the most important if you want to trigger more investors, Mondelez and beyond. We need to really understand what are the incentives to attract such investment. And when I talk incentives, I really mean what is possible in terms of carbon claiming. As you know, I mean, most companies now in different sectors have made pledges or commitment to be carbon neutral at some point. So they have money to support these claims. They will put money where they can optimize the carbon reductions they can claim. And so having this framework and much more clarity on this is, I believe, critical to be able to unleash much more funding for this.
Just to add to that, because right now there's the EU Deforestation Organization, for example, look at supply chain action, and Scope 3 at the moment is also really focused on supply chain. How essential do you feel landscape action is actually in meeting these in actually getting all of us achieve our objectives?
Well, I think it can hopefully trigger the right change in mentality. And I think that the risk that I see of the different regulations that are coming, it might actually push companies to look much more at their individual supply chains only, which will be really a return 10 or 15 years ago, I think. We got to a place, thanks to CFI, for example, and some landscape approaches as SUNAFO, where I think the companies and different actors are now, recognizing the need to accelerate collective and much more collaborative actions. And that's the risk and the downside I see of these regulations, but we can still flip this. I think there's still an opportunity, and with the right story, and again, providing the right values to the investors, we can still change this.
Right. Thanks a lot, Cedric. And Ethan, really want to turn to you in terms of what we just heard, and also what you already described earlier, right, for CFI 2.0. So how do we move to scale up these pilots happening to real implementation at that landscape level?
Great. So I like to say we have to stop talking about it and just start doing it, right? We've been talking about building these landscape collaborations and collective action for a while. Now what we're really focused on is actually starting to implement. I mentioned before that the CFI is it's 5 years into the making at this point. We've had a lot of success. We're now looking at the next phase of CFI, and companies are currently, like Cedric and everyone else, they're currently working on their CFI 2.0 action plans. And as part of their action plans that will cover the period up until 2025 through 2025, in addition to their supply chain investments, companies are also making commitments towards landscape approaches and collective action. Our intent is to actually start implementation in at least one landscape in both Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire starting in 2023. So what does that actually look like? I'm going to build upon what Mike was talking about, where we started working with 8 companies about 1.5 years ago with Proforest to develop a baseline assessment of the needs and the opportunities in the Asunafo-CDP landscape. Through this initial baseline assessment, we've been working very close hand in hand directly with the Forestry Commission, who really is in the lead as part of the Ghana Cocoa Forest Red Plus program to bring the multi-stakeholder, the multitude of stakeholders together, especially looking across commodities. We worked directly with the Forestry Commission and then with the local communities and the local structures within the landscape to then go from a baseline to the development of a management plan. And the management plan that sets the priorities, the activities, the timelines, in this case for Asunafo. Based upon that, and that has been validated and it's about to be published. Based upon that, we're now working towards the development of an investment plan, looking at the short term, the medium term, and the long-term investments, roles and responsibilities of private sector, of the government, of the NGOs, of the donors. What are the core objectives? What are the outcomes that we want to achieve? And the co-investment. Where's the funding actually going to come from to start this implementation? And what's key here is that we want to start moving forward with those short-term investments as part of the investment plan. So now, we started with 8 companies. We're going to broaden it to include all CFI companies to start collaborating in Asunafo, with the intent of, in 2023, we want to firm up those commitments and start implementation, particularly around some of those enabling conditions, working on the governance structures at the local level, like the HIA management boards, supporting the CREMAs, for example. We want to focus on protection and enforcement of the forest areas, and then farmer and community engagement as well. That's how I see, in the case of Ghana, how we move from this higher level concept of collective action to start implementation as soon as possible. And then the idea being that we build this model of collective action and collaboration based on the work that we've been doing in Asanafo, and then expand that model to other landscapes, the HIAs in Ghana, and then also the collaborative work that we're doing in Cote d'Ivoire. In the case of Cote d'Ivoire, we've been working with the governments and other stakeholders in country, with the companies as well, to identify priority landscapes that we want to build these collective actions in. We've identified 6 priority landscapes. But now the question is, where do we want to start? And we hope that in the next month or so, we can build that alignment between the government and the other parties to identify, out of those 6 landscapes, where is that 1 or 2 landscapes where we want to start building the collective action and the commitments and the investment starting in 2023. So then that would then turn into a project plan, an investment plan, and hopefully we can get this, get this moving as soon as possible.
Right. Thanks a lot, Ethan. It's really great to hear the next steps, right? And where things will come in as different pieces coming together. We have a lot of questions already on the chat, on Q&A, but I think like one that I would like to ask all the panelists, right, is this question about the elements of success of a collaborative action at landscape scale, right? And I'm wondering, if each of you could take one particular element of success, and maybe starting, Ethan, there's this also question around government. And you spoke earlier about the key role of the Forestry Commission in Ghana, but can you elaborate on in what sense how government role can determine the success of a landscape action?
Yeah, and we're lucky, and we've thought about this from the very beginning of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, that the whole platform is based upon this building of public-private collaboration between industry and government. So when you look at the actual governance structure of CFI, in either country, we are hosted by the Ministry of Eaux et Forêts in Cote d'Ivoire, and then the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources in Ghana. They're in the lead. They're the ones that are really helping to drive CFI within their countries. When we get to the actual landscape level approaches, in the case of Ghana, that obviously means that we're collaborating very closely with the Forestry Commission, as well as the Ghana Cocoa Board, all under the umbrella of the Ghana Cocoa Forest Red Plus program. So from the very beginning, we have established MOUs. We have determined our ways of working. We want to support the Forestry Commission in building these public-private partnerships that are a key component of their commitments under the GCFRP. And then from our side, we want to work with the governments, of course, to drive CFI forward and focus on the conservation restoration of landscapes, and to see how the investments and the enabling conditions from the different parties can lead us towards our overarching objectives. So throughout the process of the Asanafo STP landscape, every aspect, from the baseline to the management plan to the investment plan to the participatory processes that are happening in country, have all involved the Forestry Commission in particular. And for the most part, it's been the Forestry Commission that's been in the lead of the convening of the different parties, right? And that's the government, that's the companies, but also when you're looking at a landscape, and I think it was Cedric that brought this up earlier, taking that holistic view and looking across commodities. It's obviously not going to be necessarily within our mandate at the World Cocoa Foundation, but look at the other commodities and the other drivers of deforestation and potential other solutions, and bringing everybody to the table. And we really do look for the government to take the lead in helping to drive that forward.
Super. And Mike, I think Proforest has played the role of neutral facilitator, and I think that's really also really needed. Can you elaborate a little bit more about, especially about by bringing in this different needs, right? And like what you said, sharing without sharing earlier, that's really interesting. How important is that for a successful landscape?
Yeah, no, really important. And I mean, it Proforest together with WCF really playing that role in ASNAFO. And I think it's vital. I think, as you said as well earlier, Leonie, it just takes time, to build these collective solutions. But ultimately, trust is central to that. So unless you can get stakeholders around the table to understand common goals, different priorities, you're not going to get anywhere. And ultimately, success will only be measured by what the landscapes can deliver themselves. So it's still early days, right? We haven't, in the end, we need to be able to measure the number of farmers with access to supply chains, with improved livelihoods, number of trees planted and surviving, the reduction of the deforestation rate. We're seeing some of that, and the GCFRP that Ethan mentioned has received results-based payments for that, which is great. But now we've got to keep it going and keep it moving forward. And I hope that the role that the Proforest WCF can play, keeping the stakeholders at the table, is central to that. Now we've got to start actually moving and doing it on the ground as well.
Right, thanks. And Cedric, there are a few questions for you actually in the chat box around the business case and also the trade-off between focusing on supply chain and engaging in the wider, in a long-term, more complicated landscape approach. Can you talk a bit about that? What do you see what are the trade-offs that Mondelez is experiencing right now between these two approaches?
It's an interesting one. I think, well, the trade-off is sometimes, as a brand, sometimes you want to be able to talk and get attribution for some of the work you've done and some investment you made. And I think it's something very complicated to do when you go with a landscape approach and when you create a consortium of companies, right? And so sometimes it's hard to justify why we should be doing this as a company if we can't really tell the story to consumers. And that's where we need to educate also our leadership to understand why this is critical. This is beyond any on-shelf competition. This is non-competitive work. This is critical work that needs to take place for the long-term sustainability. So we need to look at this differently and be open to partner with companies with whom we might be competing on shelf. And that's quite a shift that needs to happen, which I think is happening slowly, but it's very different than the way we used to engage before. So I think that's an interesting trade-off. And then I think it's also, especially with the regulations, coming into force very rapidly, I think there's a need to look at maybe there's a notion of short-term compliance where we need to look at our own supply chains, but still be able to think at medium to long term what needs to really take place through more collective action. So finding that balance is a very interesting exercise and needs to be a priority these days.
Yeah, I think you're touching on several of the recommendations that we are making it in the study, right? And I totally agree with what you said, that it is a shift because the question is about collaborating with others. The attribution will be very difficult to evidence, right? But it's a contribution as a way to working together. But I think it is also critical that we work on how to make claims, right? That the companies are able to make claims, and not just the companies, right? The landscape initiatives as well. So we recognize the contribution of everybody, but we still are able to say of our role in these actions. And with that, I think there are a lot of questions and a lot of them also like highlighting some opportunities in for restoration, and we will send this across to the panelists so they will be able to see the wide range of questions and suggestions that you have made. But I think it's time for us to turn to Norma to highlight the recommendations from the study, which some of them already came out from this panel. Norma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the discussion in the panel, and hello everybody. My name is Norma Pedrosa. I'm representing CDP's Forest and the Landscape and Jurisdictional Approaches team. And well, before I start with the recommendations, I want to thank again Leonie and the TFA team for the invitation to be part of this study together with Proforest. It has been a real pleasure for us in CDP to collaborate in the research and share and even test our disclosure data regarding corporate engagements in COCO landscape and jurisdictional initiatives. And well, going directly with the recommendations, so please, yep, thank you. A lot of them have been already discussed and highlighted by the panelists. And of course, you can find more information in the documents of the study. But anyway, here are the key recommendations for midstream and downstream COCO companies. First of all, of course, to increase and scale up investments in COCO landscape initiatives to help the creation and maintenance of the longer-term expected outcomes and the business case. We need to accelerate impact on the ground. Additionally, as highlighted in the panel discussion, it is crucial to strengthen the collaborations with the governments and align your corporate COCO landscape initiatives with policy programs goals. Also to assess your priority areas and support existing and emerging landscape initiatives. As Ethan said, we need to act and start implementation, and there are already some very important landscape initiatives in place that would be could be supported by your collaboration. Also, we encourage companies as well to collaborate with other global companies to achieve zero deforestation efforts and deforestation free landscapes, sorry. And well, this is to share your lessons learned and collaborate with conveners and corporate COCO coalitions, such as the World COCO Foundation and the Forest Positive Coalition, etc. More companies are still needed to engage in collaborative approaches at scale, and experiences of the leaders like Mondelez with the COCO Life program shows that doing this engagement collaboratively has facilitated and enabled a smooth implementation. And lastly, as well, highlighted in the panel, we recommend COCO companies to collaborate cross-commodity and cross-sector to accelerate progress, amplify results, and build or sustain long-term outcomes such as multi-stakeholder governance, empowering communities, and developing reporting and monitoring mechanisms takes time, and we can't work in silos. So it is important also to do this cross-commodity and cross-sectorial to help to comply with the regulations demands, like the EU deforestation regulation, which was also discussed in the panel. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are the recommendations for all stakeholders, of course, to enable and support more COCO companies engaging in holistic approaches at scale. So first, we need to clarify claiming processes. We need to provide tools to monitor and report progress. This requires public available information systems to disclose, measure and track implementation of activities. Progress in this regard has been done very strongly by ICL, also through the annual forest disclosure through CDP, and the landscape level assessment frameworks of the Forest Positive Coalition, SourceUp, Landscale, among other tools can be supportive of this in this regard. Then we also need to support companies to operationalize their corporate climate, nature, and people goals through landscape initiatives. As mentioned, we need to provide clear alignment of landscape initiatives to meet the Science-Based Targets initiative and the Science-Based Targets for nature. And of course, to help them to comply with the regulations demands of the EU deforestation regulation and others. We encourage all stakeholders to explore opportunities to link corporate COCO initiatives with broader sustainability programs of producer countries. So governments and other facilitators and implementers of national and subnational policy programs could align strongly with COCO companies and the private sector coalitions. So as discussed in the panel, the governmental leadership and collaboration is essential to drive successful collaboration at scale. And for this, well, this is a call for all stakeholders to work and align our efforts with governmental deforestation and nature policies. And lastly, we spoke a lot about Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire examples and leadership on landscape initiatives. However, in the study, we didn't find any company engaging in landscape initiatives in other key geographies, such as Ecuador and Nigeria, which are other large producers and exporters of cocoa. So therefore, yeah, well, we encourage also to explore opportunities to develop new landscape initiatives and also for companies to engage in initiatives in other key cocoa countries. And yeah, that's it from my side, the recommendation summary. If you want to have a deeper discussion in this regard, please feel free to reach out to us. I think we all, CDP, TFA, and Proforest, engage with companies and subnational governments in different ways. And landscapes and jurisdictional approaches are key strategies for us. So we would be happy to connect and keep this conversation alive. Back to you, Leonie.
Thanks a lot, Norma. And I think, yeah, we are, well, TFA is a multi-stakeholder platform. We're a convening organization. CDP is a reporting platform. Proforest is just one of the many landscape implementers that we need, and user facilitators. So for sure, you know, what we are hoping is that this study and this webinar can inspire and can get more actors, right? And that's why we're so excited to have WCF here as the lead convener of private sector, and also Mondelez here. And so we actually are very well on time, which is quite unusual for these types of webinars. And so I would like to ask the panelists once more to provide just, if you could, what would be the one thing you say to the participants? We have 162 participants here. What would be the one thing that you would like to ask them to accelerate progress at landscape scale? And I'll go to Mike first. Mike.
Thanks, Leonie. I will be cheeky and say one thing, but for two different parts of the audience. So firstly, to companies not yet engaging in landscapes, but working in the cocoa supply chain, I would just encourage you to get involved and see how you can find a way of supporting a landscape initiative. You can start small, but you know, this is coming, and it's an important part of your strategy to help future-proof your businesses and your supply chains. And for those that are already engaged on, and also, you know, with a presence on the ground, take a look at how your existing activities could be leveraged to build, and, you know, what are the few extra things you could start on to help contribute to that pre-competitive work at a landscape level. So I think Cedric's talked about some of the great examples, and how Mondelez is looking to build from cocoa life to work beyond just their supply chain. I think if every company can do this and just look at what the next steps are that they can take to support or invest or provide in-kind support, then we're going to start moving forward as well.
Right. Cedric, I'll turn to you.
Thank you. I think as we tend to standardize the expected interventions through regulations and so on, and things we have been discussed, I think it is important to still create and make sure there's a license to try new approaches, which also means a license to fail sometimes, and make sure we create the trusted environment to share learnings. That's not always there these days. And I think it's critical. There will be things that works, and let's be honest with ourselves, there will be things that would not work. And we need to avoid reinventing the wheel in each landscape. So I think whatever we do, wherever we sit, we all have a responsibility to create that trusted environment, being an activist, being a CSO, being the private sector, being the public sector. And I think that's really critical if we want more of these to happen and be implemented and be successful over time.
That is a really excellent point, Cedric, and ones that people don't talk about enough, like the license to fail and to talk about our failures. I think it's just as important as we talk about our successes, or even more important, I think, not to repeat the same mistakes. Ethan, how about from you?
Yeah, I'm going to build off of what both Mike and Cedric had said, and we need good models. We need good models to build off of to be more successful in driving these landscape approaches. It was some 2.5 years ago that Cedric and I actually were getting into the conversation where Cedric was saying, we really need to drive collective action and landscape approaches. And we said, sure, great. How are we going to do that? And we were looking across commodities and within the cocoa sector and outside of the cocoa sector for those good models that we could really base our collaborations that we've been building over time to really help to guide the collaboration that we're building. So that plays directly into what Cedric was saying, which is the data sharing, the information sharing, the ability to share models that have not worked, as well as those models that have worked. And I think a big part of this as well is a call out to the donor community to be able to provide that level of seed funding to get these landscape initiatives started in the first place, to bring the different parties together so that we can ultimately, help to facilitate that collaboration and drive these landscape approaches and ultimately learn together. Ultimately, what we're working to do as well is to help to build that business case that we talked about quite a bit over the past hour, that will ultimately bring on board the multitude of both the public and the private sector to co-invest and collaborate within the landscape. And we can only do that if we have that level of collaboration and information sharing and seed funding to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Ethan. That piece around the financing, right? The different models of financing, different models of collaboration to accelerate action. That's also like one of the questions that we will explore more in the study. And at the end, we will have a summary report that will also touch on the financing and the role of different types of stakeholder groups, right? I think there are philanthropic donors, there are companies, there are development partners like the donor governments also that definitely have a lot of roles to play in addressing this for us to achieve sustainable production at scale, right, at landscape and jurisdictional scale. So we are about at the end of our webinar. Before we end our webinar, I would just like to say one more time, big thank you to all our speakers, Ethan, Cedric, Mike, Norma, and thank you very much for sharing your insights here. It's been very useful. And to all of you, we just want to let you know that the next report from the global study is coming out in 2 weeks. In case useful for you or your colleagues, please look out for the report on company landscape engagement on pulp, paper, and fiber-based packaging that will come out real soon. And for all of you joining us, thank you for participating. Thank you for so many questions that you sent out. We'll collate them and also share with the panelists so they see where there are a lot of interest or a lot of ideas are about. And to close, just want to say see you in the next Jurisdictional Action Network webinar, and have a good rest of the week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.